Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're having a great day so far and welcome to today's video, which is going to be very different. I am going to be doing a get ready with me. I am going to be doing my makeup throughout this video, so I will list everything that I'm using down below. But today's video is going to be the story of Katya Alexandrovskaya, who was an incredibly talented figure skater. I recently watched the documentary Harley and Katya that is currently on Netflix, and I had to talk to you guys about this story. I have a lot of thoughts, a lot of feelings. It's a story that really it's close to my heart and something that I have a lot of knowledge and experience in. So I wanted to share my thoughts and I wanted to share Katya's story with you. So without further ado, let's get started. Oh God, I literally feel so nervous. I don't know why. I guess it's just because any different type of content, it's more nerve-wracking. Like, I feel like this is such an important story and this topic is so important to me and it's so close to my heart. I feel like the pressure to really do a good job, I guess, is what it is. So I guess it's worth me giving you guys a little bit of background. If you're new here or you're just not really into like the get ready with me's where I talk about myself and my background, or like Q&As and things, you won't know this about me. But my background is sport. I was an international level swimmer when I was younger in another life, and then once I retired and went through my own very painful retirement process from high level sport, I eventually found my career, which was performance lifestyle. So if you don't know what that is, and most people don't, it's a sports science discipline, and essentially the purpose behind where this came from as a discipline was in supporting athletes, high level professional Olympic level athletes, through their retirement transition. So that is such a hard, difficult, challenging time for very many athletes who've competed at that level for many years. And back when I retired, this didn't exist. There was no support, you know, whether you retired because of injury or you just came to the end of your career or you wanted to, you'd had enough, whatever it was, you just, the day you retired, that was that. And I feel like if you're not an athlete, you've never really competed at that level, it might be one of those things that you just think, oh, what's the big deal? You just move on with your life. But the thing is about competing at that level is it is literally everything you've ever known from maybe as young as like 4 or 5, depending on the sport that you have done. Every single day of your life, you've gone and done this thing. You've gone to the pool, you've gone to the gym, you've gone to the skating rink. And you've done that every single day with the same people, your family, who literally are your whole life. You spend every single day with your teammates, training in and out. Everything you've ever known is in that sport. And the day that you retire, you don't just stop competing and that's all that you've lost. You lose everything. You lose everybody that you've ever known. And yes, you can still keep some friendships and relationships, but it's not the same. And let me tell you from experience, you'll lose 99% of them. Because if they didn't retire too, they're still there. They're still doing that. They don't have time to see you. They're still fully in it, traveling everywhere. You will never get to see them. And you will lose most of those friendships, relationships, support system around you that same day that you retire. You lose your routine, you lose your purpose, you lose the thing that you've excelled at since you were very young. And for the vast majority of people, it's extremely difficult, emotional, hard, and painful when you come out of there. And it's also terrifying because there's this huge, like, what do I do now? What do I do with my life now? Because for a lot of people, the only thing you've ever wanted to do or ever dreamed of doing was that one thing that you've now lost and is done. And that's a big part of the reason why we see such a high level of substance abuse and mental health problems, the worst mental health problems and levels in retired athletes, because they don't know what to do with themselves. They've channeled all of their energy and time and everything into this one thing. And if you're in a sport that pays very well and then you retire, suddenly your entire income is also gone. And for some sports, that might not be an issue. You know, look at football in this country or other very highly paid sports, NFL, basketball in the US, those really high paying sports, that won't be an issue. You're set for life if you're sensible. But in Olympic sport, the likelihood is that you haven't really been able to save much money at all because one, they make a sort of fairly conservative salary, and two, it's incredibly expensive to be an athlete. So the likelihood is that you're out and you're terrified, you may have very little or no savings, and you've suddenly just completely forfeited your salary because you retired from sport and your income is all based around that sport. So there's a lot of challenges when it comes to that retirement process. And so that's the career that I chose. I chose to support athletes with not just their retirement, but setting themselves up so that when they come to retire, it's an easier transition. You know, they have other strings to their bow, that they have other support systems, that they've got hobbies and experience and career options outside of sports, so that when that day comes, it's not so life ending. That's my career. So that's the reason why A, this subject is so close to my heart, and B, that I have a lot of experience, because I've not only been through this myself, but I have also supported hundreds of athletes through their own retirement, so for varying different reasons as well. Because I think, again, another sort of misconception, if you aren't in the sporting world, is that athletes retire, you know, when they're ready and when they choose, and that is actually so rare. Like the fairy tale ending to your career where you've just won the Olympic medal of your dreams and you get to go out on this massive high and you get to say, yes, I'm done now, I've done everything I want to do, I'm now going to go and settle down. That's actually incredibly rare. 99% of athletes, that's an entirely made up statistic, by the way, you get what I'm saying. A far more common way to retire is either you are injured or your body is just got to the point where you just can't continue. Your injuries are, you know, settling in. You're getting more and more little niggles, because training and competing in really any sport, but many Olympic disciplines, your body just can't continue to do that level of repetition in those really specific movements and training and competitions. When you sort of get to your 30s, it's a downhill slope. And that's, again, another issue with retiring athletes. You're spat out age 30 and you've never really got qualifications, work experience. Who's going to hire you? You're 30 years old. What have you done? Well, I've been off ice skating. I've been off swimming, you know? So it's vital that athletes are getting work experience and just experiences in general outside of their sport. But many do not have the time, do not have the capacity to do that while they're training for an Olympic Games. So it could be that you've picked up too many injuries, you can't continue, you're not able to perform at the level that you want. It could just be that you're aging out of the sport. Sports have different like aging out ages. If you're a gymnast, the aging out age can be like 22. Okay, if you're a netball player, I worked with England netball for a long time, they can play it well into their 30s. It's a little different. You know, it's a sport that you are able to compete at for a bit longer. Same with a lot of winter sports. I've also worked with winter sports in this country, and again, typically we can see athletes well into their 30s, but and you know, equestrian, same thing. But there's lots of sports, gymnastics, swimming, for example, where really if you've hit 30, you're like the oldest in the pool. And you know, there can be personal reasons as well. Once you get to your late 20s, 30, maybe you've met your life partner, maybe you want to see them occasionally in the same country, maybe you have had children or you want to have children, and again, very, very difficult to be an Olympian or a professional athlete, particularly for women, if you have had children, because that is going to massively change your body. You're going to have missed a huge amount of competition and some training time. And again, that can be the end of careers for lots of people. So typically in my experience, what's happened is you in some way didn't make the choice to retire. It's in some way wasn't fully your choice. It might have been your decision, but it's not what you would have chosen in that moment. And a lot of the time, a lot of athletes are retiring before they wanted to, and that's what makes it really super painful. So I came across this documentary on Netflix at the weekend. It's called Harley and Katya, but it was about this ice skating pair, figure skating pair. And me, you know, being a sporting person, I'm always down for a sporting documentary. I hadn't heard these names before. I wasn't familiar with Katya's story. I wasn't familiar with them as a pair. I like watching figure skating in the Olympics, but I won't claim to be some kind of figure skating expert. So the names weren't familiar to me. I'd never heard of their story, and I watched it, and it affected me so much. I was so touched by the story. I was like, I need to talk about this. I feel like it encompasses so many of the issues and problems that I've seen in my job and from being an athlete myself. And it really summarizes why I chose the career that I did. So this story mainly is going to be about Katya Alexandrovskaya's career and her life, but her partner was Harley, and that's what was covered in the Netflix documentary. If you want to check it out, it was about their partnership, how they met and everything. But I mostly want to focus on Katya, or Katerina's, life and her story, because that's really what this is all about. So figure skating is definitely one of those sports that you start young. Now, Katya was from Russia. She was born and raised in Moscow, and in a very typically Russian way, huge sport in Russia, figure skating, absolutely massive, very, very popular, huge, big system there, very, very well funded. And at the age of 4, like many, many people in that country and in her area, she wanted to try figure skating. You know, she went to her local ice rink. She started training there aged 4, super duper young, as is pretty typical again with that sport. And she just had a natural gift for it straight away. She was a natural. She immediately was like picked up by the coaches and put into like the official system, which is really very solid in Russia. It's very well funded. It's very well organized. There's a very ordered structure to the sporting system in general over there, but particularly in sports like figure skating and in winter sports in general. They're very successful. They have, you know, really serious structured programs from very early ages, and she entered into those. And then Harley had kind of a similar story, but in a very different place. So Harley was from Australia, not known for their figure skating, and obviously not a particularly strong winter sports nation, because it's Australia, you know, not a lot of facilities there for winter sport, very sort of minority sport in Australia, very low levels of funding there for this sport. But Harley was literally walking past, saw this ice skating rink and said to his mum, "Oh, can I have a go at ice skating?" Got on the rink and just started skating. And his mum in the documentary was like, she's so sweet. She says she remembers saying to Harley, I didn't know that you could ice skate. And he sort of said, well, neither did I. And that's how like natural he was that very first day. The coaches at the ice rink came over to her and said, "Is that your son? How long's he been ice skating?" And she was like, first time. So both Harley and Katya, very much like child prodigies, very much like natural superstars, born to do this sport, very natural ability, immediately had everybody's eyes on them in their respective nations. But in Australia, not the same system they have in Russia. Harley was like, you know, on his own, really. The coaches there didn't really know what to do with him, didn't really have a big training setup because he was like the only ice skater in the village, you know. But both of them wanted to do pairs figure skating, so you can do individual or you can do pairs. Both of them wanted to do pairs. That's the discipline they wanted to do. But what's pretty vital as a pairs figure skater is a partner. And both of them struggled to find a partner. Katya, I guess, had a lot of competition. She was very, very young. She couldn't really find someone to skate with that sort of matched to her. And Harley didn't have a lot of options in Australia, not a lot of skaters. He tried out with a few, none of them wanted to do it or could do it. You have to be incredibly small and light, but he is 6'1", okay? 19 years old, he's 6'1". He's holding you in the air above his head at like 9 feet. And a lot of these girls were like, no thanks. I mean, interestingly, in the documentary, Harley himself said he would never do it. So it was terrifying. So now Harley had kind of reached the limit of where he could get to with his sort of local club coach with figure skating, and he realized that if he sort of wanted to move on to like the next level, he was going to need a coach who could sort of push him to that next level. And that's when he met Galina and Andrei Pashin, who were a married couple, Russian former figure skaters, and they were kind of like, you know, the sort of next level professional high level coaches. Both Russian. They very quickly sort of said and suggested to Harley, if you want to find a partner, you need to go to Russia. That's where it's at. That's where all the figure skaters are. We, you know, obviously have lots of contacts there. We need to go there and find you a partner. And so this is where Harley met Katya. Now, at this point, Katya was 16, still very young, still without a partner. And they just kind of put them together and they met on the rink and magic happened. It was instant magic. Harley didn't speak any Russian. Katya didn't speak any English. They didn't need to speak. They just went on the ice and immediately everyone was like, wow, this is it. They are a pair. But obviously Katya was part of the Russian setup, and so it was all down to Russia going to allow her to go with Harley and train and live with him in Australia. And according to one of Katya's coaches, the Russians just didn't care. They had so many athletes, they were like, sure, what's one? Gone, we don't care, we don't need her. Interestingly, later in the documentary, Katya said that the day that she met Harley was the best day of her life, and the day before they had met, it was the worst day of her life, because it was the anniversary of when her father had died. It was a year since he had died, and she had bought her coach a bottle of vodka. It was like a tradition there that you buy your coach like a bottle of vodka on this specific day, and because she was so devastated dealing with the anniversary of her father's death, she drank the bottle of vodka herself, and she was so ashamed and so disappointed in herself. As an athlete, you know, she shouldn't have been doing that. She was only 16, she shouldn't have been doing that, and she was just at rock bottom. And the very next day she met Harley, and it was like, this is the best day of my life, and everything is like better and roses and shiny. And finally she had like hope that she could find a partner and that she was going to go off and fulfill her dreams. So they became a pair. Initially, Katya moved to Australia on like a sort of temporary several month visa, and they started competing on the junior circuit. Their first competition, after literally skating together a couple of months, they came 8th. But at the next competition, just a few months later, they won. And then in March 2017, they won the World Junior Championships, which was this massive deal. This Australian pair competing now for Australia had won the World Junior Championships in figure skating, and this was unheard of. They were then competing on the senior circuit, and they were winning, and they were medaling, and they were getting on the podium, and everyone was like, wow. Their success was just like skyrocketing. It was unbelievable. They'd only been skating together a few months. Everyone could not believe it. The Russians were furious because they had thought, oh, you know, what's one young Russian girl going to Australia? And now she was beating them, and they were fuming. Interestingly, Harley said that first year that they hated each other. Neither of them could speak each other's languages. They couldn't really communicate, but he also sort of said it didn't really matter because they just got on the ice, they didn't have to talk, and they got on with it. And obviously when they were skating, they were a very, very good match. He said they were never really like friends as such because, you know, they had that huge language barrier. They were very different people. Katya, when they met, was 16. Harley was 19. You know, different sort of life stages. So, and very, very different backgrounds. So they didn't have a huge amount in common other than the skating. Because Katya had moved to Australia on her own, she was a teenager, she didn't speak any English. She had to live with Andrei and Galina, her coaches, who obviously did speak Russian, and this was not ideal at all because obviously when you're off the ice, you want to relax, you want to get away from skating, and she's there living with her 2 Russian coaches who she didn't have a great relationship with. Now, I had a Russian coach at one point in my swimming career, so I can kind of empathize with this a little bit because it wasn't a good match for me either. You know, before I changed coaches and ended up with my Russian coach, I had always had very sort of maternal, loving coaches who were very kind, and yes, they could be tough and push me and all of that stuff that I needed when I needed it. But we had a very sort of, you know, parental type of relationship, especially when I was like a teenager. You know, I was like 13, 14, very much a sort of parent-child type of relationship with my coaches. And when I moved to the Russian, it was very different. He was very hard, a lot of shouting, very tough, no sort of rapport, no banter, no real like personal relationship there, very cold, very tough. And let me just say, that didn't make him a bad coach. And there were a lot of athletes who were very successful with this coach, just not me. It just was not a good fit for me. And everybody has their different style of coach that they get on with. Harley got on with Andre brilliantly. He liked the toughness. He didn't care about the shouting, but Katya did. She didn't enjoy it. She didn't like being shouted at. She found it upsetting, and she just never really got on that great with Andre as a coach. So imagine that being the only person that she knows that she has to live with, that speaks her language in this strange country and is kind of, you know, her person that's like mentoring her and looking after her, her guardian to a degree. Like, that's a tough situation. So now, because they've been so successful, they got funding. Funding started coming in from the Australian Sporting Association. Up until this point, they'd been paying for everything themselves. They were totally broke, paying for all their flights, paying for their ice time, paying for their own skates, paying to fly to competitions. It's incredibly expensive. Any sport's incredibly expensive. Figure skating is definitely at the higher end because you have to pay for your ice time, and that's not cheap. So everything was coming together incredibly well. Now they had the money to train whenever they wanted. They had these really successful coaches who knew what they were doing, who were equipped to take them to the level that they wanted to be. And they were just taking off as a pair. And unexpectedly, they qualified for the Pyeongchang Olympic Games, the 2018 Olympic Games. They qualified. They'd only been skating together a few months. Katya was 17 when they qualified, I guess. She would be 18 by the time they actually competed. So still a very young, very green, very inexperienced team. And now they've qualified from Australia for the Winter Olympic Games. So at this point, they had to fast track Katya's Australian passport because she was still like on sort of temporary visas, like work visas, I guess. And they had to get her Australian citizenship like overnight so that she actually was allowed to go to the Olympics, which they did. So this qualification for the Olympic Games started this huge surge of media interest. It was such a fairy tale story that, you know, the media was super interested in. It was very photogenic. You know, she was this tiny little Russian girl, didn't speak a word of English still, and he was this giant beast of a guy, this Australian. But not only that, Harley was going to become the first ever Aboriginal Winter Olympian. So it, as you can imagine, it was a very like a perfect media story. The media were lapping it up. It was all over the press. Oh my God, this pair, and they've been really successful. Like, it was a very newsworthy story. And notably around this time, everybody was just ignoring Katya. Everything was about Harley. He's going to be our first ever Aboriginal Winter Olympian. It's this huge story. He's this really handsome, huge hulk of a man with this tiny little Russian girl. And because Katya didn't speak any English, in every interview, she's just kind of stood there awkwardly off to one side. Nobody's asking her questions. If they do, she can't really understand. Nobody ever got an interpreter or tried to understand or help her so that she could be involved in the media and in the interviews. And eventually they actually just started interviewing Harley on his own without her because he could speak English and we don't really know what to do with Katya. So she just became this sort of like prop. The media also really milked it by paying for Harley's mum to go out to the Olympics because on her own she was never going to be able to afford it. She didn't have the money to fly over to Pyeongchang, which would have been a massively expensive flight, and all the accommodation and everything was too much. So that was this other huge news story. They were like surprising Harley with his mum to watch them, and they just wanted this fairy tale ending, which they didn't quite get. So So at the Olympics, their goal really was a clean routine, which in figure skating terms, they just didn't want to make any mistakes. They wanted to do their routine without any issues, without any falls, without any mistakes, and just, you know, see where that put them. At this point, you know, they were still a very new team. They were still very young, and they ultimately finished 18th, which was pretty much around where they sat in the world. You know, they were brand new onto the senior circuit, and that was like a pretty respectable result for such a new young pair. They, you know, they pretty much did what their coaches and everyone in the know would have expected them to do. They hit their goal, they did a clean routine, no mistakes, they nailed it, and they did feel like they were maybe slightly expecting a higher score. They felt like they were maybe a little undermarked, but they were ultimately happy. They did a good show of themselves, their first Olympics, and the result was decent for what they were expecting. But the media penned it as an utter failure because the media wanted their fairy story. They wanted to be able to say, oh, the first ever Aboriginal Winter Olympian and this Russian dot of a teenager, and the obviously happy ever after ending should have been at least a podium finish, if not Olympic gold. It was just never realistic. And their coach, Andre, said, you know, it was penned as this like failure. They didn't fail. They did brilliantly. They finished around where you would have expected them to if you knew skating, you know. But the press like reported it as this massive failure and then just disappeared because the story wasn't really interesting anymore. It's also just really sad for me because my husband was at those Olympic Games working, like he was a coach at Pyeongchang with the British skeleton team, and to think that they were all in that same place, it's just, everything about this story just really like, oh, it touches me, and it just feels like so close to my heart that it's just so tough to think about what these athletes went through. Now, typically after Olympic Games, you know, we talk about Olympic Games, even for staff, post-Olympic blues is a big thing, okay? You come back your whole life, at least for the last 4 years, if you've done an Olympic cycle before. If you haven't, your entire life has led up to those Olympic Games, and suddenly it's over. And you may or you may not have got the result that you wanted, but either way, after all the hype post-games has died down on all the interviews and everybody welcoming you home, regardless of your results, everything just disappears. And it feels really sad and low and depressing. It's a really tough time for athletes, but also for staff, because you've also worked that entire time up to this moment and then it's over. And it's very anticlimactic, and you come back and it's just back to normal life. So everybody takes a big break post-Olympics. Athletes especially are expected to take a really long break, maybe a month. And Harley and Katya didn't take any break. They were like back to Australia, back to training, back on the ice, and things started to go downhill. Around this time, Katya had her first seizure during training, and she did seem to see a doctor, but everybody, including her coaches, kind of put it down to her diet and maybe not eating enough. You know, female figure skaters, especially pair female figure skaters, have to be extremely light because they have to be up in the air and flying about and being thrown. And there's this huge pressure on them to, you know, be as light as possible. And whether that was coming from Katya herself or her coaches, we're not sure, but we know that Katya was trying really hard to limit her food intake. There's also rumours, unconfirmed, that she was taking diet pills to try and keep her weight as low as possible. And the coaches at that point, Galina, the female coach, a Russian coach that she was living with, said to her at that point, I want to see you eating. I'm going to like watch you. All of your meals are in front of me from now on. I want to make sure that you're feeding yourself properly so that this doesn't happen again. And that was kind of the end of it. But things were just not going as well for Harley and Katya as a pair in skating. Their results started to suffer and they started to make mistakes. There's a lot of footage in the documentary of their routines and competitions, a lot of falls, a lot of mistakes, and they just don't look like they did up to the Olympics. They're not on fire. Katya doesn't look like that sparky little fireball that she was, full of passion for this sport. She just looked a little broken, a little weak, a little tired. And in April 2018, so a couple of months after they got back from their Olympic Games, Andre, Katya's coach, actually kicked her out of his house, and they had this huge row. which was apparently down to the fact that Katya had been really upset because she couldn't go home for her birthday. She wanted to go home to Russia. She couldn't afford to do it. She didn't have enough money. So she couldn't go home. She got really upset and she drank all of Andre's beers. Andre says that he wasn't kicking her out because she'd stolen his beers. He was kicking her out because she had drank alcohol, and that was like strictly forbidden. When you're training as an athlete, you can't be drinking alcohol. You have to really, your body is a temple kind of mentality. And he had said, she can't live here anymore. We'll help her find somewhere to live, but she can't live in my home with me. And this led to a huge row. Katya basically said to Harley, I'm not working with that man anymore. I don't want him to be my coach. I will never work with him again. And Harley supported Katya as much as he got along with Andre and he, you know, didn't mind his coaching technique and style. And he'd been with him for many years. Katya was his partner and he wanted to support her. He knew she wasn't going to work with Andre anymore. So if he wanted to keep Katya as his partner, he had to support her decision and they had to find a new coach. Initially, they actually went to Canada and they kind of like self-coached themselves. They had a little bit of support from various places, but they were living on their own separately in Canada, just training, and things were just getting worse and worse. They were completely lost. They didn't have enough support there. And their results were getting worse and worse. Harley around this time said he was starting to get worried about Katya's drinking. At this point, she was 18, but she was drinking and often drunk at, you know, various times of the day that were just not normal or appropriate or healthy. He had to carry her off of a flight one time because she had got so drunk on the plane, and he was really getting concerned about the drinking. This was also leading to like behavioral issues, and obviously her performances were just really suffering and they were plummeting down like the rankings and the results list and really just completely tanking. So they decided, we need to go home. This is not working. We need to go back to Australia where we have like more support, where we have our setup, and something has to change. So they went back to Australia, and this time they invited Katya's childhood Russian coach to Australia to be their coach. Confusingly, he's also called Andre, but he's not the same Andre from before. And as soon as he got to Australia and he saw Katya in training and he looked at her and was like, what has happened? Like physically, mentally, in her skating, he was shocked because when he'd last seen her, she was really healthy. She was skating amazingly. And he was like, wow, like what has gone on here? And around the same time, one of the athlete coordinators who kind of just keeps an eye and looks out for the athletes on the Australian program, Belinda, she had been smelling alcohol on Katya. She was getting concerned about the alcohol, and at one point she actually observed Katya with like wine in her drinks bottle during training, and they were all just really worrying and stressed about this. They sent Katya for some blood tests and some health checks, and they tried to book her in, but at that time there really wasn't a lot of support or funding or availability for that, and it took months and months for her to like even get an appointment. And around this time, because they had been doing so badly in their results, they actually had a massive funding cut. Another issue, and something that is just so hard to deal with and work with athletes when they get funding cuts. You know, funding is not a salary. It's not something you're sort of entitled to. Funding is literally performance related. So if you're performing and you're doing well and the funding body thinks that you're going to bring home an Olympic medal, you'll get funding. If you're not performing and your performance takes a big dip, you're going to at least get cut, if not completely have your funding taken away. And it's very hard and it's very cruel and it's brutal and obviously unhelpful if you're having a bit of an issue with your performance and suddenly all of the money that pays for all of your training and equipment gets taken away. That's not really going to help you, is it? But it's the way that sport works. It's a business, and you know, the money doesn't grow on trees, and it is there as a performance payment. So, you know, now they were really in trouble. They were performing terribly. They were really struggling with training. Katya was really having an issue at this point with alcohol, and now they've lost their funding. So now they're going back to square one, paying for everything, paying for their ice time, paying for their coaching, paying for their equipment, paying for their travel, and their results are just continuing to go downhill. And in 2019, they had their last ever competitive skate as a pair. And watching the footage of this skate was so heartbreaking. It hit me so hard watching this skate. One, because it just starts off just magical and you get this glimpse of like what could have been, and actually how phenomenally talented they were, and what a beautiful pair they were, because it just starts off like as they were, you know, but a couple of minutes in, it just completely starts to fall apart, and all these mistakes and falls just creep in, and it's just a mess of a performance. It's really bad. Their score was terrible, their result was terrible, and just at the end, Katya's entire body language is so heartbreaking. She is broken at this point. You know, she used to be dragging Harley off the rink and like giving him a dressing down for any mistake. They can do better, this is not like, she was like on this guy, little fireball, and she just like he had to like take her in his arms at the end of this performance. She looked like a broken child. It was really heartbreaking. So in the new year of 2020, they decided to go back to Russia so that Katya could spend some time with her family, and they were going to train over there, and that was kind of their plan as to like where we go from here. She was going to be with her mum and her dog and her familiar surroundings, but it just didn't go the way that they had planned. And in January, she collapsed and was taken to hospital for tests. And devastatingly, the tests revealed that she was suffering from epilepsy. At this stage, she was 20 years old, and we never really are clear on how or why she developed the epilepsy. It can be developed later in life. There's some discussion around whether or not she may have had a head injury in training. You know, all of the coaches and athletes in the documentary talk about how, as a pairs figure skater, a woman pairs figure skater, head injuries, knocking your head on the ice is a common thing, and concussions are pretty common. It's very much recommended that during training, female figure skaters wear protection, wear helmets, some kind of protection, so that if they have falls, they're not landing head onto rock solid ice all the time. But apparently Katya was not really a fan of wearing it, and she didn't really wear protective gear during training, and her coach wasn't really telling her or commanding her to wear protective clothing. So that's a possibility, but the doctors felt like her drinking along with taking of pills. She was also found to have liver and kidney issues, a very high resting pulse rate of like over 160 at rest. She also had high blood pressure and had alcohol in her system at the time of which they did these blood tests. And ultimately the doctors told her that her health condition and her epilepsy is completely incompatible with doing sport. She will never figure skate again. So I mean, just that, hearing those words in the doc, I was heart-wrenched. I just really, like, I felt the pain of that ripping away of her entire life from 4 years old. And yes, she was finding things hard. Yes, her performance was struggling, but ice skating was Katya's entire life being, existence, her entire soul, everything she'd ever dreamt of, her entire life. Her identity was figure skating, and that day she went in and they said, you will never skate again. It's too dangerous. She could have an epileptic fit, a collapse at any moment when she's in the air. Too dangerous. She will never skate again. Absolutely devastating, and obviously Katya was completely devastated. Initially, Harley, his family, his sister, and Belinda, the athlete coordinator from Australia, had tried to sort of reach out to Katya after they had this devastating diagnosis and try and support her in some way, but she very much started to sort of withdraw, not really reply to their messages, didn't really speak to them so much. And around that point, like not much later, Harley actually had to leave Russia and go back to Australia because he only had a few month visa, so he had to return to Australia. And very sadly, and again very brutal as it seems, he had to start looking for a new partner. And while that seems really harsh and hard, again, you know, he would always say that him and Katya were not necessarily friends, but they had spent, you know, a good few years together every single day doing this dream together. So it seems really harsh and really brutal, and it did actually take him a good almost 2 years to find a partner. But he still had his Olympic dream, and as much as he was really sad about what happened to Katya, and he didn't want it to happen and he wished that it hadn't happened, he had to go back to Australia and find a new partner, and Katya was left in Russia, back with her family, no funding now, everything taken away, will never skate again. Complete soul-crushing series of events for her. And just a few months later, Katya devastatingly, so sadly took her own life. Oh, it's just so hard, so sad, so tough. And I think so much about like my job and the athletes that I used to work with. There's so much more support now, and it seems like in Australia they actually have a lot more support now. There was a huge investigation after Katya passed away into what more should we be doing to support athletes, what more can we have in place. And now Australia actually has a very similar system to what we have in England for supporting athletes in their lifestyle and working with them to develop outside interests and experiences and support them when they transition out. And in the UK, actually, we now support athletes for like a year after they have exited a program or retired to ensure that they really are, you know, solidifying their new identity, and they have support around them and they know what they're doing and they have careers and educational support if they need it. But this was a few years ago now, and the system just wasn't there and set up in Australia. And Katya, you know, was struggling. She'd had massive funding cuts, and then she had gone back away from where the system was surrounding her, and she was just left to deal with all of the issues that she already had, and then this massive, completely life-changing ending to her career, which was just ripped away from her instantly overnight with no warning and no expectation that this would ever be coming. And she was just left alone with her mother in Russia, away from her partner who had gone back to Australia, and away from all of the coaches that she'd been working with. And there was just really no support to avoid the most tragic outcome. Now in 2023, there is definitely a lot more support for athletes in Australia. The investigation into what happened to Katya and the outcome of all of the issues and struggles and difficulties that she had, and the minimal support that she was available to her, actually led to the national framework being introduced in Australia, whose goal it is to provide a safe, healthy and fair environment for athletes at all levels. And everyone close to Katya refers to that national framework as Katya's Law. Also, interestingly, not necessarily as the outcome of Katya's death, because this began prior to that happening. But in 2022, the International Skating Union actually raised the minimal age for competitors from 15 to 17. And Katya's name was very much a part of the conversation when it came to a vote. And it was almost a unanimous vote to raise that age, because people just felt like the amount of pressure and additional stress and strain, and also the amount of training pressures that puts on a 15-year-old was too much, and they needed to raise the age. And although I would have liked it to have gone into 18, but 2 years additional, I feel like 15 and 17, that's a huge amount of growth and maturity change for young athletes. That's quite a big difference, although it's a small number of years. And Katya's name was very much a part of those conversations when it came down to voting. So I feel like people really learned from this case, but it's devastating that it took Katya's outcome to promote this level of change and the building of the support around athletes, because we've had this here in the UK for years. We actually had, when I was still working for the English Institute of Sport, we actually had some members of the Australian Federation come over and look at what we were doing in the UK to support our athletes with their well-being and their welfare, and also all of their activities and the support that we were building around them to ensure that they weren't just an athlete, that they were also had jobs, they also had education, they also got qualifications, experiences, people outside of sport, friends, support system that wasn't all completely tied to their sport, so that should they pick up an injury, should they have to retire for one reason or another, their entire life didn't end that day like it did for Katya. They had other stuff going on for them. It's still going to be painful, but it isn't life-ruining and life-endingly painful, is the hope when we're supporting athletes, not just when they retire, but for years and years before, setting them up so that they succeed at something else when they retire, and they have something else when they retire, unlike how Katya felt when it happened to her. So that was really the incredibly, devastatingly sad story of Katya Alexandrovskaya. I really urge you to watch the documentary. It was obviously incredibly tragically sad the way that everything ended, but I feel like it's a really good insight into the painful side of sport, the difficult, challenging, heartbreaking side, particularly towards the end of someone's career, particularly when someone has had such a steep and fast trajectory into absolute peak of success, and then it all comes tumbling down. Quite how challenging and devastating that can be. I think this is also a really good insight into the reason why I chose the career that I did, because I was very, and still am very passionate about supporting athletes, particularly really young teenagers who are, you know, in this crazy, very adult, very challenging, very demanding world from a very young age. So I think this hopefully is a good example of what can really go horrifyingly wrong if the right support isn't in place and the right steps are not taken. So I appreciate this is a very different topic for you guys on my channel. It's a very different type of video. I hope that you found it interesting, and thank you so much for watching. If this is completely different for you, I really appreciate your support in watching and listening to this video that obviously is so important to me. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'd love to see you in the next one. Otherwise, take care for now. Bye.